I took the night shift at a small family-owned restaurant just outside of town. It was the kind of place with cracked floor tiles, humming fluorescent lights, and handwritten chalkboard menus that hadn't changed in a decade. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Clean the kitchen, prep the ingredients, and make sure everything was locked down before morning. My main responsibility was the walk-in refrigerator at the back of the kitchen, an old industrial cold room lined with metal shelves and stacked plastic containers. Temperatures were barely above freezing inside. The first time I stepped in, the cold bit straight through my jacket, and I remember thinking how eerily quiet it was in there. No dripping, no hum of machines, just stillness, like the room was holding its breath. I had a system. Every night after prep, I would clean the floor, restack the meat, and produce bins by date, seal everything properly, and lock the heavy steel door. The latch clicked with a solid finality that made me feel like the job was done right. That cold room became my little ritual, the one place I could control. But 2 weeks in, something changed. It was a Tuesday morning when I came back in after finishing my shift. I had locked everything the night before, double-checked, I'm sure of it. But now 3 plastic containers were on the floor. One had burst open, raw chicken scattered across the tile, like something had knocked it from the top shelf. I thought I must have stacked them poorly. I cleaned it up, annoyed with myself, and moved on. The next night I was extra careful. I placed each container with precision. Heavy things on the bottom, lighter produce on top. I gave the shelving unit a firm shake to test its stability. Everything held. I shut the fridge door and latched it. Walked out, flipped off the kitchen lights, and left. But again, the next morning, a mess. More containers, this time from a lower shelf. One was cracked, and a puddle of dark marinade had spread across the tile. A sticky, almost oily trail, as if something had dragged the bin before it fell. That night, I checked the camera feed. The security system covered the hallway facing the cold room door. I watched the footage, time-stamp after time-stamp. No one entered the kitchen. The fridge door never opened. Yet something had moved the containers, and something or someone had been inside. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the footage. No intruders, no flickers of movement, just silence and the cold room door, shut tight. But the containers had clearly fallen. Something had been in there, something I couldn't explain. I stayed late after my shift. I told myself it was just to double-check everything, but really I wanted to watch, to catch whatever was happening. I cleaned the kitchen, prepped the meat and sauces, and once again stacked everything into the cold room with careful precision. The shelves were steady, the containers sealed. I even laid a thin line of flour just inside the fridge door, an old trick to catch footprints. It made me feel like I had some control over the situation, even if I didn't believe anything supernatural was going on. Not yet. Then I turned off the lights and waited in the break room. It was past 3 a.m. when I finally gave in to exhaustion and dozed off on the couch. I didn't mean to sleep. I wanted to stay awake, but it was the kind of heavy, dreamless sleep that pulls you under before you can resist. When I woke up, it was dawn, the first rays of sun bleeding through the dirty blinds. I rushed back into the kitchen and yanked open the cold room door. The containers were on the floor again, but this time all of them. Every single one, even the heavy steel pot of prepped stock, lay scattered across the tiles. Some had burst open, plastic cracked, liquids congealed in puddles across the floor. The shelves themselves were tilted, not broken, just leaning like they had been forced or slammed into. And the line of flour? Completely clean. No footprints, no smears, as if nothing had crossed it. I stood there, frozen. The room was colder than usual. Not in a dramatic horror movie way, not icy breath or frostbite, but colder in a subtle, suffocating way, like the air itself was too dense, heavier. Later that day, I called the owner and asked if anything strange had ever happened there. He laughed, said the cold room was just old and needed new shelving. Probably raccoons in the roof or rats in the vents, he joked. But he didn't come to look, didn't even ask for photos. I started having trouble sleeping, not because I was scared, not yet, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the silence inside that room. I began to notice how the fan in the back wall only hummed when I was standing still. The way the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees the moment the door latched. The way I sometimes caught a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing. Metal doesn't echo, not in a room packed with food and plastic bins, but sometimes I could swear I heard something shifting, slow, deliberate. Breathing, something was in there, not just moving things. Watching, waiting, I stopped going near the cold room unless absolutely necessary. I started rushing through the tasks, grabbing ingredients, stacking shelves with trembling hands, never turning my back to the door. Every time I stepped inside, I felt like I was being watched from just beyond the edge of my vision. The fan still spun lazily, the temperature still held steady, but the air felt wrong, dense, like it was pressing against me, listening. One night, I brought my phone with me and set it to record a voice memo while I worked. I wanted proof, or maybe I just wanted to know I wasn't imagining things. I placed it on a high shelf and went about the usual routine, restocking meats, checking expiration dates, organizing the sauces. I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting to hear a thud or scrape, but nothing happened. Not until the next morning. I played the recording on the way home, expecting maybe the hum of the fan, my own breathing footsteps. But at the 3-minute mark, just after I stepped out and closed the door, I heard something else, a sharp, wet, dragging noise, and then a voice. It wasn't a word, not clearly, just a low murmur, rasped like it came from dry lungs. It stretched and faded like a sigh, except it was layered, as if more than one voice whispered the same thing in slightly different tones. I couldn't make it out. I played it back again and again. It sounded like my name. That was the last night I worked the shift alone. I called in sick the next evening, and the one after that. I told the manager I needed time off. I didn't mention the recording. Didn't say that I'd deleted it an hour later because I couldn't stand the way it made my stomach twist just hearing it play. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, I got a text from a coworker, just a photo. The cold room door open, lights on, and across the back wall, written in something dark and greasy, were the words, "Let it in." They swore no one had access to the kitchen that night. The cameras were still rolling, but the feed glitched out between 2:17 and 2:46 a.m. when it came back on. The message was already there. I never went back, but I still dream about that room, cold and still, containers scattered, something breathing in the shadows just behind the shelves. And every time I wake up, I can almost swear I hear the fan turning, slow and steady, in a room that should be silent. And I can't help but wonder if it's still waiting for someone else to forget to shut the door. I worked night shifts as a security guard in a business complex on the outskirts of the city. It's one of those older buildings, long corridors, flickering ceiling lights, outdated cameras that record in grainy grayscale. My job is routine. Mostly I sit in the monitoring room, drink bad coffee, and watch nothing happen for 8 hours straight. There's a rhythm to night security. You learn to tune out the creaks and hums of an empty building, to distinguish between normal silence and the kind that feels ... wrong. It started with the light. At exactly 3:13 a.m., one of the motion-activated lights in the east corridor would flick on, every single night. Same time, same office. Office 327. I checked the log. That room had been vacant for over a year. The company that used it packed up after some kind of internal issue, HR scandal or bankruptcy, no one really knew. But the space had been empty ever since. Locked, lights off. No keycard entries. At first, I thought maybe it was a malfunction. Sensor glitch, faulty wiring. But it didn't behave like that. It was precise, consistent. 3:13 on the dot, every night, and always followed by a sound I could never fully explain, like footsteps, light and uneven, crossing the tiles and stopping just before the stairwell. I reviewed the camera footage, expecting to see nothing, but there was something, not a person, not fully, just a shadow, long, human-shaped, but wrong somehow. It moved past the doorframe, too fast to be walking, too smooth to be running. A blur of motion that never tripped any other sensor, except the one outside Office 327. I reported it, of course. My supervisor said it was probably a bug in the system and told me to reboot the cameras. I did. Twice. The light still flicked on. The shadow still passed. I stopped mentioning it. Instead, I started writing the time down every night in my personal logbook. 3:13, Office 327, light on, shadow seen. Over and over again. No variations, no patterns beyond the time. Until the 7th night. That was the first time I saw the door to Office 327 open, just slightly, just enough to make my stomach drop, but when I checked the hallway in person, it was closed. Locked, no signs of entry. And yet, on the footage, it was clearly ajar. That's when I started to realize something inside that office wanted to be seen. The next few nights blurred together. Sleep became fragmented. Even off-duty, I'd wake at 3:13 a.m. without reason, eyes wide in the dark, heart pounding like I was still watching the hallway monitor. I stopped checking the footage for a while. I couldn't take the dread that built up every time the time stop ticked closer to that minute. But the moment you stop looking, it gets worse. On the 10th night, something changed. The motion alert didn't just trigger outside Office 327. It pinged inside. The system wasn't supposed to register anything from within that space. The motion detectors were disabled in unused rooms. I checked the security software myself weeks ago. Yet there it was, a trigger log. 3 hours, 13 minutes, and 9 seconds. Office 327. Movement detected. I switched over to the interior cam. The screen was black for a second, then the feed sputtered to life. Grainy, static-filled. The room was still empty. Desks draped in plastic, wires hanging from the ceiling where lights had been stripped out. But there was a shape in the corner, low to the ground, hunched, almost human, but it didn't move like a person. It was frozen at first, knees drawn to chest, arms locked around them. And then, with sickening, unnatural smoothness, it turned to face the camera. No features, just a blur of dark where a face should be. The feed cut out instantly. I stared at the blank screen for over a minute, unsure if I'd imagined it, but the system didn't lie. The motion alert was real. When I walked down the corridor to investigate, everything felt wrong. The air was colder near that door. Not in a way the thermostat would pick up, but like something old and damp had seeped into the walls. I placed my hand on the handle and felt something like a vibration, not physical, more like a pulsing sensation in my chest, like my heartbeat wasn't mine anymore. I left without going in. Later that morning, I checked the access logs again. There was a new name listed. One entry, 313 IMXS, granted badge ID 014582. Name, Mem Carter, that's my badge number. But I had never swiped in, I'd only watched. And suddenly, I wasn't sure that was still true. After that night, I stopped trusting the building. Not just the cameras or the badge system, the building itself. It had started to feel like something alive. Like the long hallways weren't just empty, but listening. The walls seemed to echo with a kind of low-frequency hum. I couldn't locate, but could always feel under my skin. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had cloned my badge. Maybe there was a glitch in the system logs. Maybe what I saw on the camera was a shadow, an artifact, some corruption in the footage. But the part I couldn't explain, the part that kept me awake even after I left the job, was what I found when I finally got the nerve to open the door. It was 3 nights later. I waited until 3:10 a.m., then left the monitoring room and walked the corridor with deliberate steps. I brought a flashlight even though the hall lights were on. My palms were sweating, and the keycard felt heavier in my hand than it should have. The door to office 327 was slightly ajar when I got there. Not open, just not fully closed. As if it had been expecting me. Inside, the room looked exactly as it had on the feed. Unused desks, plastic coverings, an unfinished ceiling. Dust floated in the flashlight beam like falling ash. The motion sensors were dead silent. But the moment I stepped inside, the door clicked shut behind me on its own. No wind, no draft. Just a clean, soft click, like a lock engaging. The room was cold. Not like air-conditioned cold, more like the cold of deep stone or a cellar that hasn't been touched in decades. The kind of cold that feels wet. I moved slowly to the far wall where I thought I'd seen the shape crouched in the corner. There was nothing there. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Not in the footage, not in person. On the inside of the door, carved faintly into the paint, were words. Dozens of them, scratched deep by something metal. And they weren't random, there were names. My name was at the bottom. I ran my fingers over it, and the second I did, every light in the office went out at once. The flashlight died. My phone wouldn't turn on. I stood frozen in that absolute darkness, heartbeat deafening in my ears, until I heard it. Footsteps, not outside, not in the hallway, behind the desks, inside the room. I didn't wait. I slammed into the door, threw my weight against it until it gave, and stumbled into the corridor. The hallway lights were flickering, but still on. I didn't look back. I don't know what I might have seen if I had. The next morning I quit. No notice, no explanation. I left the badge on the desk and walked away. Weeks later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemail. When I looked it up, it was listed as a landline, registered to the leasing office of the same building. The same building that had reportedly been sold and shut down 3 years ago. I never answered. But every so often, around 3:13 a.m., I'll see a notification flash on my screen. No caller ID. And sometimes, just sometimes, when my apartment is dark and quiet, I think I see a light flicker on in the hallway, just for a second, like something followed me out of that room, and it's still waiting for me to come back.